Marlon Brando didn't just act, he rewired what acting even meant. Born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1924, he clawed his way from a broken home to the most celebrated stages in the world. And by the time he was 28 years old, he was already being called the greatest actor who ever lived. But here's the thing about Marlon Brando that most people never talk about. He spent his entire life destroying everyone who loved him, and his children paid the price long after he was gone. This is the real story of Marlon Brando. Before Marlon Brando became a legend, he was a scared kid in a house that didn't want him. His father, Marlon Sr., was a traveling salesman who was cold, distant, and brutal with his words. He told young Marlon repeatedly that he was worthless, that he'd never amount to anything, that he was a disappointment. His mother, Dorothy, was the opposite. Warm, artistic, passionate about theater. She introduced Marlon to acting, to music, to the idea that performance could be a way out. But Dorothy had a problem, and that problem was about to swallow the entire family. Dorothy Brando was an alcoholic, not occasionally, chronically, devastatingly, in the way that erases a person and leaves a ghost in their place. Young Marlon would come home from school to find his mother passed out on the floor. He learned to cook for himself. He learned to navigate a house that was silent when it should have been warm. Ouch. And when things got really bad, Marlon would do something that no child should ever have to do. He would go looking for her, bar to bar, street to street, until he found her and walked her home. He was 10 years old. He didn't talk about this publicly until much later in life. When he did, his voice changed. Whatever armor he normally wore, it came off. Marlon was a disaster in school, not because he was stupid. He was observant in ways that unnerved teachers. He just refused to follow rules he thought were pointless, which, to a teenage Marlon Brando, was basically all of them. He got expelled from public school. His father, at his wits' end, shipped him off to Shattuck Military Academy in Minnesota, a last resort for boys who couldn't be controlled. It didn't work. Marlon was expelled from there too. He arrived in New York City in 1943 with $40 and a suitcase. He was 19 years old. What happened next, nobody saw coming. In New York, Marlon found his way to a drama teacher named Stella Adler. She would change his life permanently. Adler taught a method of acting that was unlike anything being done at the time. She believed that actors needed to draw from imagination, not just personal trauma. She believed in specificity, in truth, in behavior over emotion. She watched Marlon in class for 3 days. Then she pulled him aside. She told him he had something she had never seen in 40 years of teaching. She didn't have a word for it. She said it was like watching a live wire that hadn't been grounded yet. What she didn't know was how much damage that live wire was about to cause. In 1947, Marlon Brando stepped onto a Broadway stage as Stanley Kowalski in a streetcar named Desire. The audience didn't know what to do with him. He didn't recite lines, he inhabited them. He was sweaty and dangerous and magnetic and terrifying, all at the same time. Critics who had been reviewing theater for decades said they had never seen anything like it. Some of them walked out at intermission, not because they hated it, but because they were overwhelmed. Vivian Lee, his co-star, said in an interview years later that there were nights she was genuinely afraid of him on stage. He was 23 years old, and just like that, Hollywood came calling. Paramount didn't want Marlon Brando for The Godfather. Studio executives said he was washed up, difficult, too old, too heavy. He'd had a run of box office flops in the late 1960s and was widely considered a problem. Director Francis Ford Coppola pushed hard for him and nearly lost his job doing it. So Brando showed up to the screen test and did something nobody expected. He stuffed his cheeks with cotton balls, he slicked his hair back, he put on a tuxedo, and he spoke in a barely audible whisper, slow, deliberate, like every word cost him something. The room went silent. Nobody said anything for almost 30 seconds after the camera stopped rolling. The role was his. When the Academy Awards nominations came out for 1972, Marlon Brando was nominated for the Best Actor for The Godfather. He won. He wasn't there to collect it. Instead, he sent a young Native American activist named Sachin Littlefeather to the stage on his behalf. She declined the award in front of 85 million television viewers and read a statement Brando had written about the treatment of Native Americans in Hollywood and American history. The audience booed, some of them loudly. Brando didn't care. He never cared what audiences thought of him personally. That was part of his genius and part of his problem. Because the people whose opinions actually mattered to him, his own children, were about to enter the picture. Marlon Brando was married 3 times. None of them ended well. The first was to actress Anna Kashfi in 1957, a marriage that began in passion and collapsed almost immediately into something that required lawyers and police. Kashfi later wrote a memoir about the relationship that was searingly hostile. She described a man who was charming in public and controlling in private. A man who could make you feel like the only person in the world and then make you feel invincible. They had a son together. His name was Christian. Christian Brando would grow up watching his parents destroy each other in court for most of his childhood, and he was watching. The divorce between Marlon and Anna Kashfi was not clear. It was not civilized. It lasted years and produced one of the ugliest custody battles in Hollywood history. There were allegations on both sides. Police were called on multiple occasions. At one point, Brando had Kashfi arrested. Their son, Christian, was passed back and forth between them like a chess piece. There was no stability, no consistency, no version of normal childhood anywhere in the picture. By the time Christian was a teenager, he had developed the kind of damage that doesn't show up at all once. It builds quietly. It waits. Fair warning, what comes next for Christian only gets worse from here. In 1967, Marlon Brando bought an atoll in French Polynesia called Tetiaroa. 12 small islands, ringed with coastal reefs, essentially unreachable without a private boat or plane. He said he bought it to escape, to build a utopia, to live outside the system that had made him famous and that he increasingly despised. What actually happened was simpler and sadder. He retreated there and slowly disconnected from everything. His career, his relationships, and eventually his children. His kids would fly thousands of miles to visit. They'd arrive on this remote island and find their father distant, distracted, more interested in the reef than in them. One of those kids was a daughter named Cheyenne. She idolized him. Cheyenne Brando was born in 1970 to Tarita Teipaya, Brando's Tahitian co-star from Mutiny on the Bounty. She grew up primarily on Tahiti, which meant she grew up largely without her father, who was an intermittent presence at best. She was by all accounts breathtakingly beautiful, deeply sensitive, prone to extremes of emotion in a way that her family noticed from early on. She fell in love with a man named Dag Rollet, a Tahitian politician's son, older than her, sophisticated. She was devoted to him. She didn't know that her half-brother Christian had a problem with him, and she had no idea what Christian was about to do. Christian Brando grew up between 2 broken parents and a Hollywood mythology that had nothing to do with who he actually was. He had no formal education to speak of. He drifted. He struggled with heroin addiction for years, in and out of treatment, in and out of trouble, He had firearms convictions. He was, by the time he reached his 30s, a man who had been given everything and nothing at the same time. His famous last name opened doors. It also made sure everyone watched when he walked through them and stumbled. He was living at his father's Mulholland Drive mansion in Los Angeles in May of 1990. And on the night of May 16th, something went irreparably wrong. On the night of May 16th, 1990, Christian Brando shot Drag Rolett once in the head with a .45 caliber handgun in the living room of Marlon Brando's Los Angeles home. Rolett was sitting on the couch watching television. He was 26 years old. Christian's story was that it happened during a struggle, that he was confronting Rolett about allegations of abuse toward Cheyenne, that the gun went off accidentally. Prosecutors argued that evidence told a different story. Rolett had the TV remote still in his hand when they found him. Marlon Brando was in the house. He called 911. Christian Brando was arrested that night. He was charged with first-degree murder. Cheyenne, who was pregnant with Rollett's child at the time, initially corroborated Christian's account. Then she recanted. Then she recanted again. The case was chaos. The family was publicly unraveling in a way that even the most scandal-hardened Hollywood press hadn't seen before. And then Marlon Brando did something nobody expected. He got on the stand at his son's sentencing hearing. He looked at the courtroom and he wept. Not performed grief, real, wrecked, unmistakable grief. He said, "I think, perhaps, I failed as a father." Christian Brando pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years in straight prison. Marlon paid the legal bills. He paid them quietly, without a press conference, without turning it into a statement. But money was the only language Marlon Brando had ever spoken fluently with his children. He could write a check. He could not stay in a room. While Christine was in prison, Cheyenne's condition deteriorated rapidly. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She was in and out of psychiatric facilities in Tahiti. She had given birth to Rollett's son, a boy she named Tuki, and she was unable to care for him consistently. She was 20 years old, and her world had collapsed completely, and her father was not there. On April 16, 1995, Cheyenne Brando took her own life at her mother's home in Tahiti. She was 25 years old. Marlon was not permitted to leave the United States due to ongoing legal proceedings related to Christian's case. He did not attend her funeral. He never saw her buried. There are no words for that. None that are adequate. After Cheyenne's passing, Marlon Brando essentially stopped pretending. He had always been reclusive. Now he became something beyond reclusive. He retreated to Tetiaroa and to the Mulholland Drive compound, put on weight until he reached over 400 pounds, and cut contact with nearly everyone. His behavior on film sets became legend for all the wrong reasons. During the production of the score in 2001, he refused to appear in scenes with the director. He communicated only through an earpiece. He wore a muumuu. He called his character Frank Oz, as an insult to director Frank Oz to his face. Nobody fired him. He was still Marlon Brando, but nobody could reach him anymore. Not professionally, not personally. And the few people who tried found out why quickly enough. In his final years, Marlon Brando surrounded himself with a small circle of people. A nurse, a few loyal friends, the occasional visitor who managed to get past his defenses. He gave almost no interviews. When he did speak publicly, it was in fragments. A line here, a thought there. Brilliant observations about acting, about America, about the machinery of fame, wrapped in the manner of a man who had decided the rest of the world could figure it out for themselves. He told one interviewer, "Privacy is not something I'm merely entitled to. It's an absolute prerequisite." He died on July 1st, 2004. Pulmonary fibrosis. He was 80 years old. 14 people attended the private service. Christian Brando served 5 years of his 10-year sentence and was released in 1996. He never really recovered. He struggled with addiction for the rest of his life. He had the last name and none of the infrastructure. No career, no stability, no father who had shown him what those things looked like. He died on January 26, 2008. He was 49 years old. Pneumonia, brought on by a body that had been through too much for too long. His father had been dead for 4 years. They are buried on different continents. Cheyenne's son, Tuki Brando, the child of the man Christian killed, grew up in Tahiti with his grandmother. He never knew his father. Marlon had made arrangements to ensure that. He thought he was protecting someone. Tuki is in his 30s now. By several accounts, he's doing well. He became a model. He occasionally gives interviews. He speaks carefully about the family he came from. Marlon Brando spent his entire career playing men who wielded power, men who loved their families so much they would do anything for them and destroyed everything in the process. It turns out he wasn't acting.